Greetings, wanderer of twilight paths and keeper of ancient curiosities. You have ventured far this night, beyond the boundaries of common tales, into a chapter of history deliberately obscured, deliberately forgotten. Tonight, I offer you a truth that even the great chroniclers dared not set to parchment. The secret life of one called Gollum within the very heart of darkness itself. Within Mordor's impenetrable veil, settle now into the embrace of shadow and stillness, for this is a tale meant for the deepest hours, when the world grows soft and the borders between waking and dreaming begin to thin. Let my words be as a river carrying you gently toward realms of rest, as I reveal what transpired in the hidden deeps of Barad-dûr, where even starlight feared to tread. If this chronicle brings you comfort in the small hours, I ask only this: let others know of this refuge, this haven of lore and quietude, that they too might find peace in the unfolding of forgotten truths. Now, let your breath grow slow and steady. Close your eyes, if you wish. The tale begins not with thunder, but with ashes-soft, gray, and settling like a shroud upon the broken lands of Mordor. In those days, after the great wars of old, when the Dark Lord Sauron had returned to terrible potency in his fortress of Barad-dûr, there moved through the ashen wastes a creature both pitiful and cunning, a thing that had once been a hobbit, twisted beyond recognition by centuries of enslavement to the One Ring. Gollum was his name in the rough tongues of those who feared him, though within his fractured mind there echoed still the remnants of another self, a gentler voice that remembered sunshine and called itself Smeagol. He was a paradox made flesh, simultaneously predator and prey, victim and villain, a walking testament to the Ring's capacity to unmake the soul while preserving the body in a mockery of life. For long years he had dwelt in the lightless chambers beneath the misty mountains, conversing with none save his own splintered selves, dining upon blind fish and things that crept through the eternal dark. But the ring, his precious, had been taken from him, stolen. He would sand its absence, left within him a wound that would not heal, a hunger that gnawed at the very architecture of his being. Yet even in his desolation, even in his consuming need, he could not forget the weight of it, the perfect roundness of it, the way it sang to him in dreams, with a voice like silver bells heard through deep water. And so, in the years that followed its laws, he wandered, he searched, he followed rumors and whispers, the movement of birds, the taste of wind, anything that might lead him back to that which he had lost. His wanderings were erratic, guided by instinct more than reason, drawing him inexorably through ever darker lands, through the thinning forests at the borders of Mirkwood, across the marshes where the dead lay restless beneath stagnant water, and finally, fatefully, toward the southeast, where the sky itself seemed to bruise and darken beneath the weight of Mordor's malice. He did not know, could not have known, that he was being drawn as surely as iron to lodestone. The ring, wherever it had gone, had written its signature deep into the fabric of his being, and that signature called out to those who had the craft to hear it. In the tower of Barad-dûr, in chambers where the torches burned with a light that gave no warmth, certain servants of the Dark Lord had long been pursuing a particular studia, dark science of domination and control that sought to understand the mechanisms by which the One Ring bent the will and corrupted the soul. And for such a study, what better subject could there be than one who had carried the ring for centuries, who had been utterly unmade by it, yet who still lived and moved and schemed? The wastes of Mordor in those days were not unguarded. Though they appeared desolate, mile upon mile of slag and broken stone of thorns that bore no flower and soil from which nothing wholesome could grow, they were, in truth, webbed about with invisible threads of surveillance, with ancient sorceries that tasted the intent of all who entered. The Morgai, that inner ridge of mountains, forming a barrier between the outer wastelands and the central plain of Gorgoroth, was especially treacherous, for its very stones had been enspelled to whisper to the tower of all who passed. Gollum, driven by a hunger he could not name, a dim, persistent pull that seemed to promise some relief from his endless acrept along the broken slopes of the Morgai, on a night when the moon was dark and the stars were veiled by ash. He moved as he had learned to move over long centuries, low to the ground, spider-quick when speed was needed, absolutely still when stillness was wisdom. His large, pale eyes reflected what little light there was, giving him the aspect of some deep-sea creature thrust unwillingly into the upper world. He paused often to sniff the air, to press his ear against stone, listening for he knew not what. And then, without warning, the stones beneath his hands grew warm. A faint phosphorescence kindled in certain cracks and crevices, tracing patterns that were not quite letters, yet clearly carried word runes, awakened by his presence, by the particular frequency of corruption that clung to him like an odor. He hissed and tried to scramble backward, but it was already too late. The night itself seemed to congeal around him, and from the shadows emerged riders clad in ash-colored cloth that made them nearly invisible against the gray waste. They moved without sound, these servants of the tower, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods, and they carried nets woven not of rope but of some metallic thread that sang faintly when it moved through air. Gollum fought as any cornered animal fights with teeth and desperate strength, with all the low cunning that had kept him alive through the long years. But the riders were many and practiced in the taking of strange quarry, and within moments he was borne down beneath the nets, hooded so that all light was extinguished, bound at wrist and ankle with cord that tightened when he struggled. A strange, thick cloth was pressed against his face, not to smother, but to steep him in some vapor that made his limbs heavy and his thoughts slow and slurred. Through the gathering fog in his mind, he felt himself lifted and carried, slung across a saddle like a sack of meal. The motion of the horse beneath him became the motion of the world itself, rising and falling, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to mark the passage of time. When awareness returned in fragments, he was aware only of descentive, winding paths that turned ever downward, of air growing warmer and more oppressive, thick with the smell of forge work, and something else, something older and more unsettling, like the scent of storms gathering. The texture of sound changed around him. The open air of the waste gave way to the compressed acoustics of corridors, where every footfall echoed strangely, and the drip of water ore was at something less innocent. Marked time in patient intervals. Voices murmured in languages he did not fully understand, though he caught fragments of the black speech and older words, words that might have been Adonaic or some corruption thereof. They spoke of him as if he were an object, the specimen, the vector, the contaminated one. He was a thing of academic interest, a puzzle to be solved, and this realization sparked in him a dread quite different from the simple fear of pain or death. This was the dread of being known, of being seen through, of having the last private corners of self invaded and catalogued. At last the motion ceased. He was lifted again, carried down what felt like a great many stairs, so many that he lost count, and wondered if they descended to the very roots of the mountains and, then placed with surprising gentleness upon cold stone. The hood was lifted, and even the dim light that greeted his eyes felt like a blade after such total darkness. He found himself in a chamber unlike any he had seen before. It was not a cell, not quite, though there was no obvious egress save the iron door through which he had entered. The walls were of black stone, polished, smooth as glass, and they seemed to drink in the light of the few lamps that burned in niches, lamps whose flames were peculiarly steady and colorless. The ceiling arched high overhead, lost in shadow, and the floor was inlaid with patterns in silver circles within circles, spirals, and characters in scripts he did not recognize. The air tasted of minerals, and old parchment, and something acrid that made his nose wrinkle. Standing before him, patient as carved stone, was a figure that would haunt his dreams for years to come. It was a man, or had been once, tall and spare, with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent, stretched taut over the elegant bones of his face. His eyes were dark and depthless, revealing nothing, promising nothing, merely observing with the dispassionate interest of one who studied insects pinned to boards. His hands, Gollum noticed with a shudder, were the hands of a scholar, long-fingered, immaculate the nails, carefully tended it. There was something profoundly wrong about them, as if they had touched things no mortal hands should touch, and been subtly altered by the contact. The figure regarded Gollum for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, cultured, with the faintest trace of an accent that spoke of Numenor, not the bright realm that had fallen, but its darker legacy, the black Numenorians who had bent their will and knowledge to the service of the shadow. "Welcome," he said, and the word carried no warmth whatsoever, "to the Orphic Vault. You have been brought here for a purpose, small one, though you may not yet understand what that purpose is. I am Urûkhôr, in service to the mouth of Sauron, and I have studied for many years the nature of corruption, the mechanisms by which power unmakes and remakes the soul." Gollum hissed and pressed himself back against the wall, his eyes darting about for escape routes, but there were none. Urûkhôr smiled faintly, a mere adjustment of the lips that did not touch his eyes. "You need not fear immediate harm. We do not require your blood, nor shall we put you to the question in ways that shatter. What we require is far more subtle. We shall not take your words only, the shadows that carry them. We shall not break your body. Only listen to what your soul has learned to sing in the long years since the precious came into your keeping." And with those words, with that quiet promise that was also a threat, Gollum understood that his long night of experiments had truly begun. The world had narrowed to iron and leather and stone, to the hush of the Eye servants moving about their arcane work, and to the terrible patient intelligence that watched him now, waiting to peel back the layers of his being as one might carefully separate the pages of an ancient, fragile book. The Orphic Vault, so named Gollum, would later understand, for the ancient singer who descended into Death's realm and returned, though not unchanged, was a place designed for a very particular kind of violation. It was not a torture chamber in any conventional sense. There were no implements of pain arrayed upon the walls, no blood-stained stones, no screams echoing from adjacent cells. Instead, the chamber held furnishings that spoke of study and contemplation, tables laid with parchment and strange instruments of measurement, shelves bearing volumes bound in materials he could not identify, and in one corner a curious apparatus of silver tubes and crystal vials that chimed softly when anyone moved nearby. Urûkhôr did not work alone. In the hours that followed, or were they days, Time behaved strangely in that windowless deep, marked only by the coming and going of gray-robed scribes who moved about their tasks with eerie synchronization. Other figures came and went. Some were clearly sorcerers or scholars of the dark arts, conferring with Urûkhôr in low voices, examining Gollum from various angles, as if he were a text to be translated. Others were merely functionaries, bringing food if the gray paste and bitter water they provided could be called food, and maintaining the lamps and the complex patterns on the floor, which occasionally needed to be refreshed with powders that sparked faintly when sprinkled. The process began gently, almost conversationally. Urûkhôr would sit at a comfortable distance from where Gollum huddled, would pour himself a cup of some dark liquid that steamed faintly, and would simply talk. He spoke of the ring not as Gollum knew it as, his precious, his love, his torment, but as an artifact of supreme craft, as the culmination of certain principles that could, with sufficient study, be understood and perhaps even replicated in lesser forms. He spoke of how the ring worked its corruption, not through crude domination, but through a far more insidious mechanism. It learned the shape of its bearer's desires, their hungers and fears, and it sang to those depths in a voice perfectly tuned to resonate with what was already there, amplifying it, encouraging it, until the bearer's own nature became a trap from which they could not escape. The Dark Lord Urûkhôr would say, his voice a steady murmur that seemed designed to lull even as it probed, does not merely command. That is the mistake his enemies make, thinking him a tyrant who rules through fear alone. No, he understands the architecture of will. He knows that the most stable domination is that which the dominated believe they have chosen. And the ring was his supreme achievement in this art, was it not? It offered power, it offered life, it offered fulfillment of desire, and all who bore it believed themselves to be wielding it, when in truth it was wielding them. Gollum would hiss and spit at such talk, would cover his ears and rock back and forth, but he could not entirely shut out the words. And Urûkhôr was patient, endlessly patient, content to plant seeds of thought and let them germinate in the long silences. Gradually, carefully, the loremaster introduced what he called the loosening, a technique designed to relax the boundaries between Gollum's two dominant personalities, the creature called Gollum and the fading echo of Smeagol. He employed certain rhythmic patterns of speech, certain tones and cadences, combined with carefully measured doses of substances burned in censers, powders dissolved in the bitter water that made the mind drift and the edges of self grow permeable. At first, Gollum resisted fiercely. He knew, with the cunning of a creature who had survived through deception and adaptability, that they were trying to open him to see inside, and he clamped down on his thoughts with all the strength of his fractured will. But Urûkhôr had studied for many decades the nature of divided minds, and he knew that such divisions could be made to serve. When resistance was high, he did not push, he simply waited, and spoke softly to the other self, to the part that remembered sunshine and friendship and a time before the ring. Smeagol, he would murmur, do you remember the river? Do you remember the taste of fresh water, cold from the mountains? Do you remember singing before the darkness came? And despite himself, despite every screaming instinct, Gollum would feel something shift inside, would feel the softer voice rising as it had not done in years. The transition was agony and relief in equal measure, like the sudden giving way of a muscle held clench too long, and in those moments when Smeagol surfaced, when the two voices spoke in rapid alternation, the scribes would lean forward with their quills, recording not the words themselves, but something else. Something about the texture of the speech, the spaces between utterances, as if they were notating music rather than conversation. Gollum learned, in those early sessions, that yielding a little bought him breath and time. If he allowed the drift, allowed the conversation to flow between his selves, Urûkhôr would be satisfied for a while, would call an end to the session, and allow him to be taken to a small cell where he could curl up in solitude and try to reassemble the shattered pieces of his identity. Total resistance brought only longer sessions, brought the introduction of more invasive techniques, brought a quality of attention that felt like standing beneath a burning glass. And so he began to calculate, began to play a deeper game. He would yield certain memories, certain emotions, but he would carefully curate what he offered. When they pressed for details about the ring, he would give them surface textures, the weight of it, the smoothness of it, the way it felt warm or cool, depending on some ineffable variable. But he would withhold the deeper truths, the secret names it had whispered to him, the visions it had shown of mastery and dominion. When they probed for knowledge of where the ring had gone, who had taken it, he would flood his mind with contradictions and riddles, with fish and riddles and moonlight, until the trail of thought became a labyrinth in which even he could lose himself. Urûkhôr noticed this game, of course. He was far too skilled an interrogator not to recognize when he was being managed. But rather than anger him, it seemed to intrigue him. "You are clever," he said one day, after a particularly tangled session in which Gollum had led him through a maze of half-truths and misdirections. "Cleverer than you appear. The ring taught you well. I think taught you how to hide even from yourself. Good. We shall need that cleverness for what comes next." And with a gesture, he summoned attendants, bearing a burden wrapped in dark cloth. They moved with exaggerated care, as if what they carried might at any moment wake and require containment. When the cloth was drawn back, Gollum saw a series of curious objects that resembled lanterns, but lanterns such as he had never seen before. Their frames were of black iron, twisted into shapes that hurt the eye to follow. And within the frames were stretched panels of something that was not glass, not paper, not any material he could name. It caught what little light there was and held it, drank it down, so that looking at the lanterns was like looking into a well at midnight. "Lamps of starless silk," Urûkhôr said softly, and there was something in his voice that might have been reverence or might have been dread. "We shall steep your memories in a light that is not light, and we shall harvest what grows in that darkness. Tomorrow the true work begins." The silk had been harvested, Gollum learned, in fragments over subsequent sessions, from the weavings of Shelob's distant kin. Spiders of enormous size and malevolent intelligence that haunted the passes of the Ifel Dwath, the mountains of shadow that formed Mordor's western wall. These creatures were of ancient lineage, descended in some fashion from Ungoliant, herself that primordial horror who had served Morgoth in the elder days, who had devoured the light of the two trees and poisoned the world with her hunger. Though Shelob and her lesser relatives possessed nothing like their great ancestress's power, they had inherited certain arts, certain capacities that made them valuable to those who understood how such things might be exploited. Chief among these inherited traits was the quality of their silk. Where ordinary spider silk was strong and sticky, designed to trap prey through physical means, the silk of these shadow spinners had a different property. It was a trap for light itself. When woven properly, when shaped and treated with the right compounds, It became a membrane that drew illumination inward and held it, creating a space of absolute negation that was somehow more profound than mere darkness. Stand in natural darkness, and your eyes would adjust, would find what little light there was and magnify it. But within the compass of starless silk, there was nothing for the eye to grasp. No photon, however faint, was the darkness of the void before creation, of the empty spaces between stars. But Urûkhôr and the other loremasters of the Orphic Vault had discovered a stranger property still. The silk did not merely drink physical light, it seemed capable of cupping something they referred to as mind glow, the subtle emanations of memory and emotion that all thinking creatures produced as continuously as they produced heat. Wrapped in such silk, placed within such a field of absolute reception, a subject's thoughts would bloom outward like ink spreading through water, and those with the training to perceive it could taste the flavor and texture of those thoughts without seizing their specific content. It was, Urûkhôr explained in one of his pedantic moments, a form of observational sorcery that had taken decades to refine. The danger when dealing with anything touched by the One Ring was contamination. Draw too close. Try to grasp the substance of such corrupted thoughts, and the corruption could flow backward, could stain the observer. Several of his predecessors in this study had been lost that way, he said, with the casual tone of one discussing a minor experimental setback, their minds drawn into communion with the ring's echo and twisted beyond recovery. But the starless silk provided a buffer, a way to sample the psychic residue while maintaining a degree of separation. It was safer, if one could use such a word, for any practice conducted in the bowels of Barad-dûr. The sessions with the lamps were profoundly disorienting. Gollum would be positioned in the center of a circle of the lanterns, each carefully oriented according to diagrams the scribes consulted with anxious precision. When the command was given, shutters would be drawn over the room's conventional lamps, and the starless silk would drink even that meager light, leaving him suspended in an absence so complete that he lost all sense of his body's boundaries. There was no up or down, no here or there, only a vast, listening emptiness that seemed to press against his mind from all directions at once. In that state, memory came unmoored from time. The careful chronology by which he usually navigated his past, this happened before that led to this dissolved, and all moments became equally present. He found himself simultaneously in the cold water of the Anduin centuries ago, feeling the fish slip from his grasp, crouched in Bilbo's parlor, staring at the riddle game with desperate intensity, curled in the deepest depths under the misty mountains with the ring heavy on his finger, and here, now, in this terrible present from which there seemed no escape, the experiences layered upon one another like badly shuffled cards, and somewhere outside the circle he could hear Urûkhôr and the scribes murmuring to one another, recording their observations in language he did not fully understand. There, see how the resonance shifts when the river memory surfaces. Note the frequency, the particular quality of longing, ... The bifurcation is pronounced. We can clearly distinguish the two voices even in the subtextual harmonics. Mark this carefully. When we introduce the prompt precious, the entire field intensifies by nearly 40%. The attachment is not merely psychologically, has become ontological. The ring has rewritten the fundamental frequencies of his being, ... double quotes. Through the chaos of unmoored memory, Gollum clung to one discovery that gave him a thin hope. He could, with effort, influence which memories brightened and which remained dim. The starless silk might make his thoughts visible to the loremasters, but it did not compel full disclosure. If he focused, if he deliberately pushed certain memories to the surface while suppressing others, he could, to some degree, curate what they harvested. It was exhausting work, requiring a constant expenditure of will at a time when will was already stretched to breaking. But the alternative was to give them everything, to open himself completely, and that he could not do. And so when they pressed for memories of the ring itself, he would comply. But he would show them only the surface relationship, his joy at its beauty, his terror of its loss, his obsessive need to possess it. What he would not show them, what he guarded with every scrap of strength, were the deeper teachings the times. When the ring had spoken to him, not in the language of temptation, but in something older and more fundamental, had shown him glimpses of the structures that underlay reality, the patterns of force and name that the great powers used to shape the world. Those secrets, he sensed with animal cunning, were what they truly sought, and those secrets he would carry to whatever end awaited him. During one session, Urûkhôr had him deliberately dwell on the memory of the moment the ring was taken, that terrible instant in the goblin tunnels, when Bilbo Baggins, invisible and unknowable, had leaped over him and fled, and he had felt the absence of the ring like the sudden absence of a limb. The memory was agony to inhabit, but Gollum forced himself to stay with it, to let it fill the space the starless silk created. And as he did so, he carefully, deliberately, allowed another memory to surface as well. The memory of a small round door in a green hillside, of a pleasant voice, asking riddles, of a name Baggins, Baggins spoken in a tone of pride. He felt the attention in the room sharpen, heard Urûkhôr's breath catch slightly. "There," the loremaster said softly. "Did you mark that? A name, clearly significant, and a place, some manner of dwelling. We must extract these coordinates, ... double quotes." But Gollum was already flooding the memory with distractions, with the smell of fish and the sound of dripping water and the texture of cold stone, diluting the clarity, making the image swim and break apart. When the session ended and the conventional lamps were relit, he allowed himself to slump forward in apparent exhaustion, which was not entirely feigned, and saw Urûkhôr watching him with an expression of mingled frustration and grudging respect. "You play a dangerous game, little one," the loremaster said. "But games eventually end, and when this one does, you will have given us what we require, whether by choice or by necessity." Yet, in his cell that night, Gollum allowed himself the smallest hiss of satisfaction. They had learned the name Baggins. Yes, but he had given them nothing that would help them find the Shire, nothing that would help them understand the nature of what Bilbo had become, or where he might have gone. He had yielded territory to keep them satisfied, to make them believe they were making progress, but the citadel, at the center of his knowledge, remained his own. For now, the technique Urûkhôr called the splintering of will was introduced after many sessions with the starless silk. After the loremasters had mapped what they called the topology of Gollum's fractured psyche. It was based, as Gollum gradually came to understand through overheard conversations and the loremasters' occasional pedagogical monologues, on a principle the ring itself had demonstrated, that a single coherent will could be induced to divide against itself, creating internal tensions that made the divided being far easier to manipulate than a unified one would be. The ring had done this to all its bearers, though with varying degrees of success, depending on the strength and nature of the bearer. It created what the loremasters called the dialogue of corruption, an internal argument between the self that recognized the ring's influence and sought to resist, and the self that desired what the ring offered and sought to rationalize submission. The genius of this mechanism was that both sides of the dialogue were genuine aspects of the bearer's nature. The ring did not implant foreign desires, but merely amplified what was already present. Thus, the bearers argued with themselves in perfect sincerity, exhausting their will in internal conflict, while the ring slowly, patiently tilted the balance toward surrender. Gollum, who had carried the ring for centuries, had experienced this splintering to an almost unprecedented degree. The voice he called Smeagol and the voice he called Gollum were not merely rhetorical positions, but had become something approaching separate personalities, each with its own memories, preferences, and moral frameworks. They contested with each other constantly, sometimes agreeing to an uneasy alliance, more often pulling in opposite directions, leaving the body they shared lurching through existence like a boat with two quarreling captains. What Urûkhôr proposed to do was to drive the splintering deeper still, to find within the existing division a finer thread, the essential frequency of ring-longing that both personalities shared, and to isolate it to make it speak separately from the rest. If they could extract the pure note of corruption, the fundamental harmless-seeming hunger that the ring had written into the very substrate of Gollum's being, they could study it, understand it, and most importantly, reproduce it. The procedure was monstrous in its subtlety. Gollum was placed again in the circle of starless silk, but now the loremasters introduced additional elements. A low, sustained chant in the black speech that seemed designed not to convey meaning, but to induce a particular mental state. A rhythmic pulse that matched and then gradually desynchronized from heartbeat, creating a sense of internal discord. They withheld food and water until his body's desperate hunger harmonized with the psychological hunger for the ring, collapsing the distinction between physical and spiritual need. And through it all, Urûkhôr spoke, his voice a constant thread winding through Gollum's fragmenting awareness, asking the same question in endless variation. What do you want? What do you truly want? Strip away the words, the stories you tell yourself. What is the want beneath the wanting? For 3 days, or was it more? Time had ceased to have reliable meaning. Gollum endured this dissolution. He felt his two voices speaking in counterpoint, Smeagol and Gollum, arguing and agreeing and arguing again. And beneath their familiar discord, he became aware of something else, something he had never consciously perceived before. A third voice, or perhaps not a voice at all, but a pure tone, a frequency, an ache given form. It was the longing itself, abstracted from all objects and narratives, the naked architecture of desire that the ring had built into him. The moment he became aware of it, the moment he could perceive it as something separate from himself, the loremasters moved with practiced precision. The chanting shifted in pitch and rhythm, and Gollum felt something like a hook sink into that newly visible thread of pure wanting. There was a sensation of terrible cold, of extraction, as if some essential part of himself was being drawn forth through a needle's eye. He screamed, or tried to, but his voice seemed to have no connection to his throat, and the sound emerged as a thin, keening wail that the starless silk drank down as it drank all light. When he regained full awareness, and that took time, as his mind reassembled itself in stages like scattered water, reforming, he found himself slumped on the stone floor, trembling with exhaustion so profound that even breathing felt like climbing a mountain. Urûkhôr stood nearby, holding a small crystal vial no larger than a finger, within which something moved, a mote of darkness, or perhaps of light, he could not tell which, that pulsed gently, as if in time with a heartbeat. Extraordinary Urûkhôr was saying to one of the other sorcerers, "The coherence is far beyond what we achieved with the other subjects. This is pure distillate, the very essence of ring-forged hunger, separated from the accidents of personality and memory. If we can broadcast this sif, we can induce this resonance in others, we will have achieved what the Dark Lord has long desired. A mechanism to bind the will of multitudes without the need to forge rings for each of them." Gollum did not fully understand the words, but he understood enough. They had taken something from him, had reached inside and extracted a piece of his corruption, like venom milked from a snake, and they meant to spread it, to pour what they had taken from him into other throats, to unmake others as he had been unmade. The realization kindled in him a complicated feeling that was not quite anger. He was too broken for clean anger, but was perhaps the shadow of an old instinct toward fellowship, a dim recognition that to inflict his suffering on others would be a crime. It was the faintest flicker of the soul that had once been called Smeagol, the part that had known friendship and loyalty before the ring devoured those capacities. The flicker did not last, it could not. Not after all he had endured, but in the moment of its existence, it accomplished something. It sharpened his resolve to resist, to misdirect, to survive, and eventually escape. And in that moment of clarity, exhausted though he was, Gollum began truly to plan. He understood now the shape of their intent. He understood that they needed him for something beyond simple interrogation. And he understood that as long as he was needed, he had value. And where there was value, there was possibility. He would bide his time. He would play the role of the useful specimen. He would learn what he could of their craft and their intentions. And when the opportunity came, if it came, he would slip their bonds, as he had slipped so many bonds before, vanishing into the shadows that were his oldest and truest home. Urûkhôr seemed to sense some change in his prisoner, some subtle shift in the quality of his defeat. He knelt beside Gollum and studied his face with those dark, empty eyes. "You are thinking," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Good. Thinking means you have not broken beyond use. We will rest you. Now you have given us what we needed for this phase. But understand, little one, that we have barely begun. The Chorale of Ash requires many more ... donations ... from you before it will be ready for the field. And I suspect you will find the next stages considerably less gentle than what has come before." Then he straightened, gestured to the guards, and Gollum was lifted and carried away to his cell, where he curled into the smallest possible form and tried to remember who and what he had been before the ring, before Mordor, before all of this. But those memories were like stars seen through deep water, distant, wavering, impossible to grasp, and eventually he gave up the effort and simply endured, as he had learned over long centuries to endure, waiting for the next session, the next horror, the next tiny opportunity for resistance or escape. The eye itself intruded upon the work of the Orphic Vault on a day that began like any other, if the word day could be applied to the timeless depths beneath Barad-dûr, which ended with Gollum's fate decisively altered. The intrusion came without warning, as the will of Sauron always did when it chose to manifest. A sudden, oppressive weight in the air, as if the very atmosphere had become iron, pressing down upon all present with a force that transcended the merely physical. Gollum had been in the midst of another extraction, half submerged in the peculiar fugue state, the starless, silk-induced, when he felt something vast and terrible turn its attention upon him. It was not perception in any normal sense. There was no sight, no sound, but rather a quality of being known, of being suddenly and absolutely visible to something incomprehensibly greater than himself. If the gaze of Urûkhôr felt like standing beneath a burning glass, this was like standing beneath the sun itself at the very moment it exploded. A radiation of awareness that penetrated to the core. For a moment though, whether it was truly a moment or something both longer and shorter, he could not say. He felt his entire being laid open. Every memory, every thought, every secret and hidden thing, lifted and examined with the dispassionate thoroughness of a surgeon cataloging organs before excision. And in that moment of absolute exposure, he felt the vast presence seize upon certain elements, certain fragments of what he carried, and amplify them, turning them over to catch them in a different light. Baggins, Shire, Halfling. The names resonated like great bells struck in sequence, and with them came an urgency that crashed down upon the Orphic Vault like a wave. The presence withdrew as suddenly as it had come, leaving Gollum gasping and shaking, his body slick with cold sweat, his mind reeling from the violation. Around him he dimly registered chaos. Scribes had collapsed at their desks, several of the loremasters were on their knees, and Urûkhôr himself stood rigid, his face even paler than usual, his lips moving soundlessly as if he were receiving instructions through some channel Gollum could not perceive. When speech returned to the chamber, it was Urûkhôr who spoke first, and his voice was tight with an emotion Gollum had not heard before. Something that might have been fear, or might have been exaltation, or some terrible fusion of both. The eye has spoken. The experiment is to be accelerated. All other concerns are secondary to the matter of the halfling, and the location called Shire. We are to redirect our resources. One of the other loremasters, a gaunt figure whose face was hidden behind a mask of worked silver, spoke with evident reluctance. Master Urûkhôr, the Chorale is not yet stable. The last trial revealed catastrophic coherence. Failures to deploy it prematurely would risk. I am aware. Urûkhôr cut him off, and there was an edge to his tone, like a blade drawn across stone. The eye is also aware and does not care. The Lord Sauron has perceived a threat that supersedes our careful schedules. The ring stirs moves in the world. After long silence, and we must have our instruments ready. The broadcast trials will continue, but the subject. He turned to look at Gollum, and in his gaze was a new calculation, a reweighing of value and use. The subject will be prepared for deployment. He knows the halfling. He can find what we cannot, and with the proper leash, he will lead us directly to what the eye most desires. Over the hours and days that followed, the character of Gollum's captivity shifted fundamentally. Where before the focus had been on extraction, drawing out his memories, his corruption, the frequencies of his ring-twisted soul, now the focus turned to preparation and control. He was to become, in Urûkhôr's carefully chosen words, an instrument of pursuit, a hound upon the scent. The change brought with it certain grim mercies. The sessions with the Starless silk became less frequent, for they had what they needed from him for now, enough distilled essence to proceed with their trials. He was given better food, or at least more of it, to build back some of the strength the extractions had leached from his frame. And crucially, he was given periods of supervised freedom within the deeper levels of Barad-dûr called it. Soft tethering, allowing him to roam certain corridors under distant watch, testing whether his instincts might lead him toward information or places of value. It was during these periods of soft tethering that Gollum began to discover the hidden geography of Mordor's foundations, the layers upon layers of construction and destruction that lay beneath the surface. The tower that rose in terrible splendor above Gorgoroth was merely the visible crown of something far more extensive. Roots that delved deep into the bones of the mountain, chambers and corridors that descended through multiple strata of history. Some were clearly of recent construction, built or rebuilt by Sauron in his current incarnation. These had a particular character, all sharp angles, and geometries that seemed designed to channel force rather than merely enclose space. But below and between these newer works lay older passages, sections that had been built by different hands with different purposes, now pressed into service by the Dark Tower, but never entirely assimilated. It was in these older spaces that Gollum found refuge. His guards mostly, disciplined by fear of their masters, but not particularly invested in close supervision of a creature they viewed as a half-starved wretch would follow him at a distance as he explored, but they were disinclined to follow him into the truly deep places, the sections where the air grew cold and stale and there were no torches, where the darkness was absolute and the echoes fell strangely. And it was in such a place that Gollum found the cistern. The underways, as he came to think of them, were a network of older masonry that lay beneath even the deep prisons and the Orphic Vault, accessible through cracks in the newer construction that the builders had either overlooked or deemed too insignificant to seal. These were not sewers, precisely though there were elements of water management in their design, but rather something like maintenance corridors, serviceways by which the original builders had moved unseen through their works. They had the feel of Numenor, long removed from the glory of the island kingdom. This was the work of exiles, of engineers and masons who had come east after the downfall and brought with them the old skills, even as they bent those skills to darker purposes. The stone here was different from the fused volcanic rock that made up Barad-dûr's newer levels. It was quarried stone, precisely fitted, and though it was darkened by age and the seepage of mineral-rich water, it had a quality of endurance, of patient resistance to the weight pressing down upon it. The wards and listening spells that Sauron had woven through his fortress seemed less effective here, as if the older stone simply refused to carry certain kinds of sorcery, retaining some memory of a time before the eye's dominion. Gollum navigated these spaces with growing confidence, his large eyes perfectly adapted to the near-total darkness, his sense of touch and hearing sharpening to compensate where even his eyes could not serve. He moved through narrow passages where the walls pressed close, through chambers that might once have been cisterns or storage vaults, through sections where the original ceiling had partially collapsed and new tunnels had formed in the rubble. And it was while following the sound of water, clean, trickling sound so different from the thick, sulphurous seeps of the upper fortress that he discovered the place that would become his sanctuary. The cistern lay at the convergence of several of the older passages in a chamber that had been carved with evident care from the living rock. It was not large, perhaps 20 feet across, but it was deep, and in its depths lived fish. They were pale things, blind and translucent, evolved or adapted over uncounted years to this sunless realm, but they were fish nonetheless. And the sight and smell of them woke in Gollum a hunger that was older and more fundamental than anything the ring had taught him. This was the hunger he had known in the long years beneath the mountains. the clean animal need that had sustained him when all else was madness and echo. He caught one on his first visit. His hands were still quick, despite everything. The vault had done to him manned the taste of fresh flesh, cold and faintly mineral, was the first genuine pleasure he had known since his capture. He crouched there at the cistern's edge, tearing at the small body with teeth and fingers, and felt something in him settle, some layer of panic and desperation easing to a manageable level. More than the fish, though, the cistern offered something else, the smell of rain. There was a crack somewhere in the chamber, a fissure too narrow to be seen, but wide enough to carry air, and through that crack came a scent. He had nearly forgotten the scent of open sky, of weather, of a world beyond walls. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there, and it was a promise. The fortress could be escaped. There were ways in and out, hidden in the ancient bones of the place, that even the eyes watching craft could not entirely seal. He returned to the cistern whenever his soft tether allowed, making of it a refuge where he could crouch in the darkness and feel, for brief moments, almost free. His two voices, which had been ground nearly to incoherence by the experiments, found in this place a kind of peace, an environment, simple enough water, stone, fish, shadow, that Smeagol and Gollum could agree on its value. They would sit together in a rare harmony, eating slowly, listening to the drip and flow of water, feeling the faint breath of outside air, and planning. Because they were planning now, both of them, united in the determination to survive and escape. They understood that Urûkhôr meant to use them, to send them out as a hound upon a leash, and they understood that such an arrangement, carefully managed, might be their only chance to get beyond the walls. But they would need to know more about the leash, about the plan, about the timing, and they would need tools, or knowledge that could serve as tools, to slip the leash once they were beyond the fortress's immediate grasp. It was while sitting at the cistern on his fourth or fifth visit, the awareness came slowly as a prickling of the skin, a sense of being watched that was distinct from the generalized oppression of Mordor's surveillance. He went absolutely still, every sense straining, and after a long moment he caught it, the faintest scrape of cloth against stone, the minute disturbance of air that suggested movement in the passages leading to the chamber. He turned slowly, ready to bolt or to fight, depending on what emerged, and saw a figure standing in the entrance to the cistern chamber, human figure, thin as a blade, wrapped in the gray robes of a scribe. The figure made no move toward him, did not call out or attempt to grab him, simply stood there in patient silence. After a long moment, it reached into its robes and withdrew something which it placed deliberately on the stone floor before stepping back. Then, without any further gesture or sound, the figure retreated the way it had come, vanishing into the dark passages with barely a whisper of cloth. Gollum waited, muscles tensed, for this to reveal itself as a trap, but nothing further happened. Eventually, driven by curiosity that was stronger than caution, he crept forward to examine what had been left. It was a shard of slate, palm-sized, with characters scratched into its surface. The marks were crude, done hastily or by someone unused to writing, but they were clear enough. A rune that he recognized it was the mark for Ungol, the spider, and beneath it, the number 3, rendered in simple strokes. Gollum stared at the slate for a long time, turning it over in his hands, testing its weight, as if physical examination might reveal what these marks meant. Ungol spider, and 3 days, 3 nights, 3 of something. And who was this mute scribe who risked punishment to leave such a message? What did they want? What could they possibly gain by communicating with a prisoner, a specimen, a thing to be used and discarded? The questions had no immediate answers, but the slate itself was a fact, undeniable and strange, evidence that within Mordor's hierarchies of power and subjugation, there were still currents he did not understand, still actors playing games whose rules were hidden. He tucked the slate into the ragged remnants of his clothing and returned, in the days that followed, to the cistern again and again, hoping for another message, another sign, and in time his patience was rewarded. The scribe, for it became clear over several encounters that this was indeed a scribe from the Orphic Vault, one of the nameless functionaries who maintained records and copied formulae, was a creature as broken in its way as Gollum himself. Gollum never learned the full story, could only piece together fragments from context and the laboriously scratched messages left on slate, but the outline was clear enough. This had been a human once a man or woman. Gollum could not determine which who had been taken into Mordor's service and whose tongue had been cut out to ensure certain secrets would never be spoken. Without speech, the scribe had no value in the hierarchy beyond basic record-keeping, and thus occupied a position both essential and invisible, present at the most sensitive experiments, yet deemed too diminished to constitute a threat. But the scribe could still write, and the scribe could still think, and over years Gollum had no way to know how many the scribe had apparently been watching, learning, building a private store of knowledge that no one suspected. The slate messages, decoded over the course of many furtive exchanges, revealed a mind both cunning and meticulous, a mind that had decided, for reasons Gollum never fully understood, to offer aid. Perhaps it was simple pragmatism. The scribe recognized that the Chorale of Ash, if it succeeded, would make slavery more absolute, would close the small spaces in which creatures like them survived through cleverness and self-effacement. Or perhaps there was some residue of humanity left, some flicker of fellow feeling for another ruined thing. Or perhaps, and Gollum thought this most likely, the scribe simply recognized an opportunity to inject chaos into the system that had devoured them, to plant a seed of failure in the dark machinery. Whatever the reason, the information the scribe provided was invaluable. Through patient exchanges conducted in the cistern chamber, Gollum would leave questions scratched in the dust or on scraps of stone. The scribe would return with answers. On slate he learned the schedule of the broadcast trials, the locations where they would be conducted, and crucially, the nature of the chorale itself. The Chorale of Ash was, as Urûkhôr had hinted, a mechanism for mass corruption, an attempt to replicate on a grand scale what the One Ring accomplished with individuals. It worked through resonance. The splinters of ring longing that had been extracted from Gollum were to be implanted in key figures, captains, lieutenants, any who commanded small units. Sand then activated through a coordinated broadcast of sound and will. Drums would establish the fundamental rhythm, horns would carry the main harmonic, and hidden among these physical sounds would be a sorceress component, a projection of Sauron's will shaped into the pattern that the splinters had been tuned to receive. When activated, the splinters would harmonize with the broadcast, and the carriers would find their will temporarily subsumed into a collective, their individual desires and fears temporarily overridden by the pattern. They would become, for the duration of the chorale, parts of a single instrument, obedient and unified in a way that even fear could not reliably produce. The effect was meant to be temporary. The loremasters had not yet achieved a permanent binding, but even temporary, it would be potent. An army that moved as one, that felt no fear, no hesitation, no individual will, would be nearly unstoppable in the field. But the scribe's notes revealed weaknesses. The coherence was brittle, dependent on maintaining the precise frequency of the broadcast. Any significant disruption, expected sounds, variation in the rhythm, or strong individual resistance could shatter the pattern, leaving the carriers stunned and vulnerable. Moreover, the splinters themselves degraded with use. Each activation burned away a portion of their potency, meaning that the chorale could not be used indefinitely without fresh extractions. And there was a date, 3 nights hence. During a period when the watch at Cirith Ungol, the great stair leading up through the mountains of shadow, would be deliberately thinned. This detail puzzled Gollum initially, until the scribe explained with laborious scratches. The trial was to be conducted near the pass, and the reduced watch was intended to prevent too many eyes from witnessing the experiment before it was perfected. The implication was, Cleriff 1 wanted to leave Mordor unseen. That would be the window. But that was information for later. First would come the trial itself, the test of the chorale. And Gollum understood with sick certainty that he would be required to witness it, perhaps even to participate in some capacity. Urûkhôr would want his reaction, would want to measure how the source creature responded to seeing his corruption weaponized. The night of the trial arrived with no ceremony, no warning beyond the detail of guards appearing at Gollum's cell and gesturing for him to follow. They led him through passages he had not traveled before, upward and outward from the deepest levels, through sections where the air began to taste of ash rather than stone, until at last they emerged into a cavern of substantial size, carved, or perhaps naturally formed, that had been converted into a proving ground. The space was filled with orcs, perhaps 50 of them. Arranged in loose rank sand, at one end stood a platform where Urûkhôr and several other loremasters presided over an array of instruments, great drums of various sizes, horns made from materials Gollum could not identify, and between them, devices of crystal and metal that hummed with a low, unsettling frequency even when not apparently activated. Gollum was placed in an alcove where he could observe but not interfere, chained loosely to an iron ring more to mark his status as prisoner than out of any real expectation that he would flee in this company. And then, with a gesture from Urûkhôr, the trial began. The Chorale of Ash, when it was finally unleashed, was both more and less terrible than Gollum had anticipated. It began with the drums, simple pattern at first, almost like a heartbeat, steady and primal. The orcs, who had been muttering and shifting with the nervous energy of creatures who sensed something wrong, began to settle, to match their breathing to the rhythm. Then the horns joined, not in melody, but in layers of sustained tones that seemed less heard than felt, vibrations that resonated in bone and belly. And beneath and between the physical sounds, Gollum could sense the other component. The sorceress broadcast that the instruments were shaping and channeling. It was like nothing he had experienced before, taught the seductive whisper of the ring. Not the invasive penetration of the eye's attention, but something colder and more impersonal. A pattern seeking to impose itself on the raw material of consciousness. He could feel it pulling at him, even from his alcove, trying to find purchase. And he resisted instinctively, flooding his mind with riddles and fish and cold water. Anything to disrupt the pattern's grip. But the orcs, implanted with the splinters, had no such defense. As the chorale built in intensity, as the drums and horns and hidden harmonics wove tighter together, Gollum watched them change. Individually, they were crude things, driven by hunger and fear and the simple loyalties of the pack. But as the chorale took hold, something else emerged. They began to move in perfect synchronization, turning as one, raising weapons as one, their faces slackening into a kind of empty serenity that was more disturbing than any expression of rage or hatred. Urûkhôr, watching from the platform with evident satisfaction, called commands in a voice that was itself musical, pitched to harmonize with the ongoing broadcast. Forward march, halt, weapons ready, form square, reform to line. And the orcs obeyed with preternatural precision, their movements lacking the usual sloppiness and aggression, instead displaying a discipline that would have done credit to the armies of the West. For perhaps 20 minutes, the demonstration continued, the loremasters testing various formations and commands, measuring how quickly the chorale-bound orcs could execute complex maneuvers. And it was impressive, undeniably, so Gollum could understand why the Eye desired this power, could see how an army so bound might roll over any conventional defense. But he could also see the brittleness, the fragility that the scribe had warned of. The orcs moved in perfect unison, but there was a quality of automation to it, a lack of the individual cunning and adaptability that even orcs possessed. They were parts of a machine, and like any machine, they were only as flexible as their design allowed. And then the pattern broke. It happened suddenly, without warning. From somewhere outside the cavern came a sound, something far off, muffled by distance and stone, but distinct. It might have been a cry, or the crash of falling rock, or something else entirely. Later Gollum would never be certain what it was, but it was irregular, unpredictable, a note that did not fit the pattern of the chorale, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The orcs stumbled, their perfect synchronization fragmenting. Some fell to their knees, as if their strings had been cut. Others stood frozen, weapons half-raised, their expressions confused and lost. A few began to wail, a thin, keening sound, like the cry of animals in pain. The drums tried to compensate, the drummers pounding harder to re-establish the rhythm. But it was too late, the coherence had shattered, and trying to force it back only seemed to make things worse. Urûkhôr's face, usually so controlled, twisted with frustration. He gestured sharply, and the drummers ceased. The horns fell silent, and the sudden absence of the chorale was like a pressure releasing. The orcs collapsed where they stood, many of them vomiting, or simply curling into themselves, shaking. A few those who had been closest to the instruments, who had received the strongest dose of the pattern, stared blankly at nothing, their minds apparently still caught in the space where the chorale had been unable to return to individual consciousness, now that the pattern had been torn away. The loremasters descended from the platform, moving among the fallen orcs with the dispassionate interest of physicians examining plague victims. They took notes, measured responses, examined eyes and pulses. Urûkhôr stood apart, arms folded, and Gollum could see him calculating, weighing the success against the failure, determining what adjustments would be needed. Eventually, the loremaster's gaze found Gollum in his alcove, and he crossed the space with measured steps. "You saw," he said, and it was not a question. "You saw what we have built from what you gave us. Impressive, yes, but also flawed, brittle. The coherence fails too easily, and the recovery He gestured to the orcs, some of whom were still insensate. Leaves much to be desired. Gollum said nothing, merely watched with his large, unblinking eyes. Urûkhôr continued, seeming to need to speak his thoughts aloud, to process the failure. The Dark Lord is ... impatient. He wishes the chorale perfected before the spring campaigns. But it cannot be perfected, not truly. The ring worked its corruption over years, over centuries in your case. We are trying to compress that work into moments, and the substrate cannot bear it. Unless ... double quotes. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. Unless we work with the grain rather than against it. Unless we employ the tool the ring itself created, rather than trying to duplicate it. And with those words, Gollum understood that his status was about to change again, that the role of specimen was about to give way to the role of instrument. The command came directly from the eye, transmitted through channels that made even Urûkhôr flinch with the force of their imperative. The experiments were to be suspended, the broadcast trials put on hold. All resources were to be redirected toward a single goal, finding the halfling called Baggins, finding the one who had taken the ring, and the creature called Gollum, who knew that halfling, who had been in his presence, who carried within his twisted soul an attunement to the ring itself, was to be the primary instrument of the search. But the eye was not foolish. It understood that Gollum could not be simply released and trusted to return with news. He was treacherous, slippery, motivated entirely by his desire to reclaim the ring for himself. He would need to be leashed, but the leash would need to be subtle something that would allow him to range far, to follow his instincts and cunning, while still ensuring he remained under surveillance, that his general location and direction could be tracked. The solution the loremasters devised was called a sight thorn, and its preparation occupied them for 3 days of careful sorcery. It was a sliver of obsidian, no larger than a needle, that had been shaped and treated with arts derived from the Nazgûl themselves, those 9 kings who had accepted rings and been consumed by them, reduced to wraiths bound utterly to Sauron's will. The ring-wraiths existed in a state between full presence and pure absence, visible in the world, yet also partially dwelling in the unseen realm where the ring's power was most potent, and they had over centuries developed certain capacities to perceive and track what ordinary sight could not grasp. The sight thorn was a fragment of that wraith perception, crystallized into physical form. Once implanted damned, the implantation was a small horror in itself, involving a ritual Gollum, endured with clenched teeth and hissing fury. It would resonate faintly but persistently, a signal that the Nazgûl could taste from a great distance. It was not domination, not direct control of the mind or will, but rather attunement, a way of staging the eye's attention at one remove, allowing Sauron's most feared servants to sense Gollum's general direction, and, if they focused, to receive faint impressions of his emotional state, his fears and desires. "You will be our hound," Urûkhôr explained, as the implantation wounds were dressed, but a hound on a very long leash. "You will be allowed to hunt as you see fit, to use your cunning and your knowledge of the halfling. But you will not be able to hide from us, not entirely. The 9 will always know where you are, will always be able to find you if you stray too far from your purpose. And should you actually locate the ring, ... double quotes. His smile was thin and utterly cold. They will know that too, and they will come. Gollum feigned gratitude, bowing and scraping, calling them precious masters, promising faithfulness and swift hunting. But internally, His two voices were united in a single purpose. The Sightthorn had to be neutralized, smothered, or at least muffled sufficiently to give him room to maneuver. The knowledge the scribe had given him returned. Starless silk, the material that drank light and confused resonance, could be used to dull certain sorceries, and he knew where to obtain such silk, knew who might be persuaded to grant it. But first, before the actual release, came one more task that the loremasters deemed necessary, a pilgrimage of sorts, a journey to Cirith Ungol to take counsel with the great spider who laired there. Shelob was ancient, older than the Dark Tower in its current form, a creature of terrible power who served no will but her own. Yet she was useful to Mordor, for her presence guarded the pass, and her hunger discouraged certain intrusions more relevant to the current purpose. She possessed knowledge of concealment and passage, of how to move through the mountains when all ways seemed watched, and her silk Urûkhôr, implied, without quite stating, might be of use in managing the Sightthorn, not to remove it, which would be both impossible and unwise, but to modulate its signal, to create controlled periods of diminished tracking, when stealth was absolutely necessary. Gollum understood this was a test as much as a practical measure. Urûkhôr wanted to see if he could negotiate with Shelob, could survive the encounter and return with something useful. If he succeeded, it would confirm his value. If he failed, if the spider devoured him, then he had been less useful than anticipated, and resources could be redirected elsewhere. The journey to Cirith Ungol took most of a day, ascending from the deep places through gradually higher levels of the fortress, then out through guarded gates into the ashen waste, and finally toward the mountains of shadow, where the pass climbed through rock. Urûkhôr accompanied him, along with a small escort of armed guards who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. None of them spoke, and the silence was oppressive, filled only with the crunch of ash underfoot and the occasional groan of wind through the mountain-est teeth. The entrance to Shelob's domain was marked by stone guardians, silent watchers, whose eyes held a pale, unnerving luminescent sand beyond them. The path narrowed and descended into a tunnel that breathed with a warm, organic stench. The guards would go no further, and after a moment's hesitation, even Urûkhôr stopped at the threshold. "She knows you are coming," he said quietly. "I have sent ... word. Through channels she respects. What bargain you strike is your concern, but return with her blessing, or do not return at all. I will wait here until dawn. If you have not emerged by then, we will seal the passage and consider you lost." And with that, Gollum was pushed gently forward into the dark, and the tunnel seemed to swallow him like a throat. Shelob's lair was a kingdom of web and darkness, of passages that twisted according to no logic save the spider's ancient whim, where the walls themselves seemed to pulse faintly with a life that was neither plant nor stone, but something that predated both. Gollum moved through this realm with his senses stretched to breaking, every instinct screaming that he was in the presence of something vast and patient and utterly without mercy. Yet he did not flee. He understood with the cunning that had kept him alive through so many dangers that flight would mark him as prey, and prey would be taken. Instead, he moved deliberately, making small sounds to announce his presence, not words, but hisses and clicks that carried no aggression. The sounds of a scavenger seeking permission to pass, not a challenger seeking conflict. And in time, he felt her attention settle upon him like a great weight. She did not reveal herself immediately. Such a revelation would have been crude, wasteful. Instead, she made him feel her presence through 100 subtle signs. The faint vibration of webs stretched across passages, the warmth of exhalation from side tunnels, the sense of mass moving in the darkness just beyond perception. She was tasting him, testing him, determining what manner of creature had entered her realm and what he might be worth. When she finally appeared, it was not as sudden revelation, but as gradual materialization, as if she were condensing out of the darkness itself. She was enormous, far larger than Gollum had anticipated. Despite all he had heard, her body a great glossy mass of segmented plates, her legs each as thick as a man's torso, ending in points that could have easily pierced armor. Her eyes, and there were many, reflected what little light there was in shades of green and silver, and in those reflections Gollum could see himself, tiny and fragile, repeated a dozen times. For a long moment neither moved. Then Shelob spoke, and her voice was not sound, but a vibration in the air, in the stone, in the webs, a method of communication that bypassed ears entirely and resonated directly in the mind. Asterisk, small thing, broken thing, you taste of the ring and of the tower, a curious flavor. Why are you here? Asterisk, Gollum swallowed, fought to keep his voice steady. Great, great. They send us? They do. The masters below say we must speak with you. Must, ... double quotes. He struggled for words that would not give offense. Must learn certain wisdoms about paths, about concealment, about silk. Asterisk wisdoms. Asterisk the thought came with a texture that might have been amusement. Asterisk the tower dwellers desire my wisdoms. They who think themselves the masters of all dark things. And what does the broken thing offer in return for wisdom? What can you give that I might want? This was the moment Gollum had been preparing for, the negotiation his survival depended upon. He had nothing material to offer, no food, no treasure, no power, but he had information, and he had potential value. We can bring you meat, he said carefully. Fresh meat, tender and unsuspecting. We know of one who travels, who must come this way eventually, if he seeks to enter the Dark Lord's land. A halfling, soft and plump, not like the orcs you must endure. And we can lead him here, can make sure he takes the path that passes through your realm. The spider was still for a moment, considering. Asterisk, a halfling, curious. And why would this halfling come to Mordor? What would drive such a creature into darkness? Asterisk, he carries a burden, Gollum said, and now he was on dangerous ground, revealing things that might draw unwanted attention. A precious burden, a ring. The ring, he brings it toward the tower, though he does not wish to. And we, ... He paused, letting his two voices blend into a shared truth. ... We want it back. It is ours, our precious, and we will do anything to reclaim it. Asterisk, asterisk. The vibration carried a note of understanding, even of satisfaction. Asterisk, the ruling ring. I have tasted its echo before, in others who passed through my realm in earlier ages. A potent thing, a thing of dominion, but the tower wants it to, does it not? You would betray this halfling to me, and betray me to the tower, and in the chaos hope to seize your precious for yourself. You are treacherous, broken thing. Asterisk, yes, Gollum agreed simply. There was no point in denial. Treacherous, yes, but useful. We can serve you, and serve ourselves, and perhaps neither of us must serve the tower more than we choose to. The spider moved then, circling him, her legs creating a complex rhythm on the stone. Asterisk, a bargain. Then, I will give you what you need, a thread of my silk, and the knowledge of how to use it to cloud the towers watching. In return, you will lead the halfling to my door, when the time comes. Whether I devour him or merely render him helpless for you to reclaim your precious is my choice, not yours. These are my terms. Gollum bowed low, not so much in respect as in acceptance of the reality of their relative positions. We accept, great lady. We will bring him, but the Silket must be strong enough to muddle the thorns they have put in us, the seeing stone they have planted. Can your silk do this? Bring me your arm, Shelob commanded, and when Gollum hesitantly extended his thin limb, she produced from within herself, from some gland or spinneret, he could not see a strand of silk, unlike any he had encountered in the Orphic Vault. It was not white, but rather an absence of color, a thread that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it, and when she wound it carefully around his wrist, he felt an immediate cooling, a sense of mufflement, as if certain channels that had been open were now partially closed. My silk confuses resonance. Shelob explained as she worked. It makes angles lie, makes distances uncertain. The thorn in you sings to the nine-eye, can taste its frequency, but wrapped in this the song becomes confused, harder to locate precisely. You will not be invisible to them, but you will be ... blurred. Use it wisely, for I will give you only this much, more, and the tower would sense the theft. When she was finished, she stepped back, and Gollum examined the dark band around his wrist. It looked almost like a bracelet, though no ornament had ever felt so subtly wrong against his skin, and he understood that this was both gift and goaded would help him, but it would also remind him constantly of his obligation to the spider. Go now, Shelob commanded. Return to your masters. Tell them we have reached an accommodation, and when the time comes, when the halfling is near, I will know. I will feel him approaching, and you will guide him to me, or I will consider our bargain void. Gollum backed away, bowing repeatedly, and fled through the tunnels with as much speed and dignity as he could manage. When he emerged at the threshold where Urûkhôr waited, the loremaster's eyes immediately found the dark silk at his wrist. She gave you what you needed. Yes, precious master, Gollum hissed. The great lady has been generous. She has. We have ... understanding. She will help with the hunting. She will... Urûkhôr studied him for a long moment, and Gollum had the uncomfortable sense that the loremaster understood far more than he was letting on, that he recognized the multi-layered nature of whatever bargain had been struck. But in the end, Urûkhôr simply nodded. Then we return to the tower. You will be given provisions, a map showing the western approaches, and released tomorrow night under the dark of the moon. The Nine will be informed of your deployment. Hunt well, little hound. Find us the halfling and his precious burden. That is your only purpose now. The final night in Mordor, in the deep places beneath Barad-dûr, Gollum spent in the cistern chamber, surrounded by the sound of dripping water and the faint scent of outside air. He had not been chained. There was no need now. With the sight-thorn singing in his flesh end, he used the freedom to prepare. The scribe came one last time, materializing from the passages like a ghost, and laid down a final slate. On it was scratched a simple message, *, 3 paths west. Northern is watched, southern is trapped. Go there, *. Gollum studied the message, committed it to memory, then scratched his own reply in the dust. *, why help? What do you gain? The scribe produced another slate, already prepared. *, you are chaos in their order. Enough reason, *. They regarded each other for a moment, these two ruined creatures, and something passed between them that was not quite fellowship, but was perhaps its shadower, recognition of shared damage of survival, bought at terrible cost, of the small revenges available to the powerless. Then the scribe departed, and Gollum was alone with his plans. The spider's silk lay cold against his wrist, and beside it he had wound other things. Strips of his ragged clothing, twisted into rough knots that he had learned could produce faint sounds when rubbed together specific frequencies that might disrupt resonances. He had also gathered from the cistern a handful of small pebbles, smoothed by water, that he had arranged in patterns that Starless silk had taught him to recognize broken circles, spirals that terminated wrongly, shapes that refused to resolve into meaning. He did not know if any of these preparations would truly help. He was neither sorcerer nor loremaster, merely a creature who had survived through observation and animal cunning. But he had watched the Vault-S work for long enough to understand the principle. Sorcery was pattern, and patterns could be disrupted by introducing discord, by layering incompatible rhythms and shapes until the coherence fractured. When dawn came, or what passed for dawn in that sunless realm, marked only by shifts in guard rotations and the distant tolling of a Beleriker himself, came to the cistern to retrieve him. "It is time," the loremaster said simply. "You will be taken to the Lithlad Gate and released with 3 days' provisions. The Nazgûl know your scent now, know the taste of the thorn. They will monitor you from a distance, but they will not interfere unless you stray from purpose or approach the ring itself. Hunt, track, find us, the halfling. Do this, and when the ring is recovered, you will be ... rewarded. Fail, or attempt to flee beyond our reach ... He did not need to complete the threat. Gollum bowed and scraped, playing the part of the obedient creature, all while his mind raced with the steps he would need to take. First, survive the actual release. Second, reach the forgotten stones the scribe had mentioned, the old Numenorian markers that might provide some shelter from the Eye's newest watching craft. Third, attempt the unbinding, the muffling of the Sightthorn to the point where he could move with some freedom. And fourth, get out of Mordor entirely, putting distance between himself and the tower before they realized how much of their leash he had slipped. It was a plan born of desperation and partial knowledge, and it would probably fail. But he had survived worse odds, had endured centuries of solitude and madness beneath the mountains, had outlasted the ring's attempt to fully consume him. He would survive this too. He had to, because the precious was out there somewhere, and he would find it, would reclaim it, no matter what fires he had to walk through or what bargains he had to make. They led him through the fortress one last time, up through the levels he had descended in bondage, through corridors that smelled of ash and metal and the indefinable scent of gathered malice. As they climbed, the weight of the Eye's attention lessened, fractionally not gone. Never gone, but distributed across so many tasks and servants that he became merely one mote of concern among thousands. At last they emerged into the open air of Mordor, and even that poisoned atmosphere tasted sweet after so long in the depths. The sky was the color of old bruises. The ground beneath his feet was ash and slag. But it was outside, it was space, and his muscles sang with the need to run, to flee, to put distance between himself and his captors. But not yet. Not with guards still surrounding him, not with the journey to the gate still ahead. They traveled through the daylight hours, and in Mordor, daylight was a relative term, a slightly lesser darkness passing through regions where great works were underway. where orcs and enslaved men labored to build siege engines and forge weapons. Gollum saw the preparations for war and understood that time was running short, that spring would bring campaigns, and the eye desired the ring recovered before those campaigns began. At last, as the bruised sky darkened toward full night, they reached the Lithlad Gate, barely a gate at all. More a gap in the outer ridges, where the slag fields ran down toward the broken lands beyond Mordor's immediate control. Here the guards stopped and, with evident relief, simply pointed outward. "Go," their captain said. "Your leash is long, but not infinite. Fail the eye, and the nine will have you succeed. ... Double quotes. He shrugged, the gesture eloquent of his opinion of Gollum's chances. And then they turned and marched back toward the fortress. And Gollum stood alone beneath the darkening sky, feeling the wind from the west touch his face for the first time in months. He waited until the guards were well out of sight, until even the sound of their boots had faded, and then he moved. The Lithlad was well named the Ash Plain, a vast expanse where ancient eruptions had layered the land in such depth that almost nothing grew, where the wind sculpted dunes of gray powder that shifted and flowed like a dead sea. It was, in its way, beautiful a landscape reduced to pure geometry, to the play of light and shadow on monochrome surfaces, but it was also treacherous, for the ash could be deep enough to swallow the unwary, and the wind could rise without warning, scouring flesh from bone if one was caught without shelter. Gollum moved through this realm with the nervous energy of temporary freedom, keeping to the harder ground where the ash was thinner, reading the terrain with senses sharpened by necessity. He was looking for the forgotten stones the scribe had mentioned, and he found them as full dark descended, a line of markers, each about waist high, carved from some dark stone that was not native to this region. They were ancient, their surfaces weathered smooth, but the shapes were still visible, not writing exactly, but a formal geometry, circles and angles that spoke of intentional craft. These were Nemenorian in origin, he realized, though from which era he could not say, perhaps from the early days when the exiles first explored and mapped these lands, before Sauron had subverted their kingdoms. The stones had been surveyors' marks, part of some long-abandoned effort to catalog and measure the world, and they carried within their geometry a kind of ... resistance to newer impositions. The eyes watching craft, which worked through different principles, seemed to flow around them rather than through them, creating small pockets of relative obscurity. Gollum crouched in the shadow of the largest stone and set to work. He drew from his ragged clothing the various tools he had gathered, the spider-s silk already wound around his wrist, the knotted cords, the smoothed pebbles. He added to these some of the ash itself, forming it into patterns on the ground, not the elegant designs of the loresmasters, but crude approximations, shapes he had memorized from the floors of the Orphic Vault. Then, working slowly, wincing at the discomfort, he took a strand of the Starless silk and wound it around his throat, directly over the place where the sightthorn had been implanted. The silk was cold, so cold it almost burned, and wrapping it was like wrapping wire around bare skin. But he forced himself to continue, layering it in the specific pattern Shelob had shown him, creating a mesh that would confuse resonance. As he worked, he hummed not quite a song, but a broken rhythm. The dissonant intervals that he had learned would fracture pattern, and he placed the pebbles around himself in the broken circles he had memorized, creating geometry that refused to resolve. The effect was subtle. Nothing dramatic happened. No flash of light or thunder of sorcery, but he felt it nonetheless. A fading, a dimming, as if he were slipping sideways out of focus. The scythorn still sang. He could feel its presence, but the song had become muffled, directionless, like a voice heard through deep water or heavy fog. Would it be enough? Would the 9 notice immediately, or would they interpret the dimming as simple distance, as their hound moving into regions where the sight lines were naturally unclear? He had no way to know. He could only hope and move, and try to put as much distance between himself and the tower as possible before they sent someone to investigate. He gathered his meager provisions and set off westward, leaving the Numenorian stones behind, navigating by instinct and by the faint, persistent pull he felt, even now, the ache that the ring had written into his soul, calling him toward something he could not quite name, in a direction he could not quite specify, but which felt, in the deepest fibers of his being, like homeward. The journey out of Mordor took days he lost count, for time in the Ashlands had a way of stretching and compressing, depending on the emptiness of each hour, but eventually the character of the land began to change. The ash grew thinner, exposing rock and hard-packed earth. Thorns appeared, twisted and malevolent, but thorns nonetheless, signs of life, however grudging. The sky lightened fractionally, from the color of old bruises to something approaching slate, and the weight lifted, the oppression that had pressed down on every moment in Mordor. The sense of being constantly watched and measured began to ease. It did not disappear, he suspected. It would never entirely disappear, not with the scythorn still singing in his flesh, but it became more bearable, less like an iron helmet locked around his skull, and more like a distant attention that might be evaded with care and cunning. When at last he crossed out of the Lithlad and into the broken lands beyond Mordor's immediate dominion, when he climbed a rise and looked back to see the tower as a distant spike against the lightning sky, he allowed himself a moment of something that was not quite triumph, but was at least satisfaction. He had survived the Orphic Vault. He had learned secrets the loremasters had not meant to teach. He had slipped their leash, if not entirely, then at least enough to breathe, to plan, to hunt on his own terms. He touched the silk at his wrist and throat, feeling its alien coolness, and thought of Shelob waiting in her darkness, and of Urûkhôr in his vault, and of the eye that saw so much, but perhaps not quite everything. And he thought of Baggins, of the halfling who had stolen his precious, and of the Shire where such creatures lived, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would find them. He had crossed half the world before to pursue the ring. He would cross it again. He had time. He had survived so long already that time had lost its meaning, and he had need, and he had now knowledge. The ring called to him, faint but persistent, a frequency the vault had taught him to hear with new clarity, and he would follow that call, would let it lead him northwest and west, through the valleys and forests and broken places, until at last he came to the doorstep of the thief, and then they would see. They would all see the dark tower, the great spider, the loremaster with his cold hands and patient voice. They all thought they had used him, had shaped him into their tool. But Gollum had been shaped and reshaped so many times that he had learned to flow through the hands that would mold him, to take what they offered and turn it to his own purposes. He was the hound, yes, but he chose his own hunt. And so Gollum, or Smeagol, or the creature who was both and neither, turned his face toward the north and west and began the long pursuit. The experiments in Mordor's depths had changed him in ways he did not yet fully understand. They had taken pieces of his corruption and tried to weaponize them, but in doing so they had also given him insights, had taught him to hear the ring's song with a clarity he had not possessed before. He was, in a sense, that the loremasters would have found deeply ironic, a better tracker now than he had been when they captured him, more focused, more attuned, more capable of distinguishing the specific frequency of his obsession from the noise of the world. The Chorale of Ash, that mechanism of mass corruption they had built from his suffering, lived on as a kind of echo in his mind. Sometimes, in the depths of night, he would feel it trying to rise, trying to impose its pattern on his thoughts, and he would have to fight it down with riddles and contrary rhythms, with the old games and songs that had kept him sonore, at least functionally, the long years beneath the mountains. But the echo taught him something valuable. He understood now, in a way he had not before, how fragile such mechanisms were. The chorale was powerful, could bind an army into terrible unity, but it was brittle, dependent on continuous reinforcement, vulnerable to disruption. And if the Dark Lord's great work was brittle, might not the Dark Lord himself possess similar vulnerabilities? Might not the very absoluteness of his power create faults that a small, clever, determined creature could exploit? These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that could draw the eye's attention if dwelt on too long, so Gollum learned to think them only in fragments, in the spaces between other thoughts, in the language of riddle and indirection that had always been his truest tongue. He traveled mostly at night, avoiding the few roads and settlements, living on what he could catch or scavenge, fish from streams, birds unwary enough to nest where he could reach roots and fungi that his centuries of cave dwelling had taught him to identify. He grew stronger as the leagues passed, his body recovering from the months of captivity, muscles remembering their old skills, and as he traveled, his two voices, Smeagol and Gollum, the remnants of innocence and the voice of corruption, began to find a working accord. They had different desires, different moral frameworks, but they agreed on the essential purpose: find the precious, take it back, survive. Everything else was negotiable. Sometimes, in the small hours, the softer voice would wonder what they would do if they actually succeeded. If they actually recovered the ring, would they hide again, retreat to some deep cave, and lose themselves in the ecstasy of possession? Or would the ring, having been away from them for so long, have changed its bond, weakened its hold? Would they perhaps be strong enough to what? Resist, destroy it. Even frame the thoughts felt like blasphemy. But the thoughts came nonetheless, planted perhaps by the vault's meddling, by the forced separation of self that had allowed him to see the ring's corruption from outside for the first time. He had been made to observe his own obsession as if it were a specimen under study, and the observer and the observed were not quite the same creature anymore. The Sightthorn continued to hum in his flesh, quieter now, thanks to Shelob's silk, but never entirely silent. He imagined the nine occasionally turning their hooded faces in his direction, tasting the air, feeling the faint echo of the thorn's song, and nodding, satisfied that their hound remained on the scent. Let them think so. Let them believe he was proceeding according to plan. The further he got from the tower, before they realized how much leash he had truly slipped, the better his chances. Weeks became months. The land changed around him as he moved northwest, the barren wastes giving way to the edges of the dead marshes. those haunted pools where the slain of ancient battles lay restless beneath stagnant water. He avoided the marshlights, the corpse candles that drew travelers to their doom, using paths he half remembered from previous wanderings. Beyond the marshes lay the beginning of Mirkwood's Reach, that great forest gone dark and tangled under a shadow not of Sauron's making but older, sourced from the fortress of Dol Guldur, where the necromancer who was also Sauron, though few understood the connection, had dwelt for long years. The forest was dangerous, but it was also maze-like, full of paths that twisted and doubled back, and for a creature as small and cunning as Gollum, it offered concealment. And somewhere beyond the forest, beyond mountains and rivers and the long leagues of Middle-earth, lay the Shire, that place of green hills and round doors, where halflings lived in peace and plenty, unaware of the great powers that circled them like sharks smelling blood. That was where Baggins had come from. That was where the trail must lead. But it was a long road, and winter was coming, and there were many perils between here and there. Gollum had patience. He had always had patience. The terrible patient hunger of the addict who can wait months or years for the next fix, but he also had urgency now, impressed upon him by the memory of the eye's attention, by the knowledge that he raced not only to reclaim the ring, but to do so before the tower's vast machinery of war and sorcery could grind into motion. He traveled on, a thin shadow against the land's greater shadows, a creature unmade and remade, and now, perhaps, remaking himself yet again, according to no design but his own fractured will. And in the depths of Barad-dûr, in the Orphic Vault, where the lamps of starless silk still hung, Urûkhôr stood before the devices that tracked the Sightthorn's song and frowned at what he heard. The signal was there, faint and distant, as expected. But there was something about its quality, some texture of interference, that gave him pause. "He is cleverer than we gave him credit for," the loremaster murmured to himself, "or more desperate, or perhaps both. He has found something to muffle the thorn, to cloud our sight, but not entirely, not yet. And when the time comes, when he approaches what we seek, the thorn will sing clearly, whether he wishes it or not. Let him run, let him hunt. He is still our instrument, whether he knows it or not." And far to the northwest, Gollum felt a cold shiver run through him, a sudden intensity in the thorn's humming that made him gasp and clutch at his throat. For a moment he felt the eye's attention brush him again, tasting, measuring, and then move on. They knew, or suspected, but they were allowing him to continue, were choosing to trust the leash, however muffled, which meant he had time, but not infinite time. He would have to move carefully, would have to mask his ultimate intent even from himself in the moments when the eye looked closest. He touched the silk at his wrist, drew what comfort he could from the memory of Shelob's vast patience, and continued his journey. A creature caught between too many competing powers, trying desperately to carve out a space where his own will might matter, where the precious might once again be his. The tale settles now, like ash upon still water, into a grim and fated quiet. Asterisk, asterisk, the hound has slipped the kennel, though the leash remains, slender as spider silk, terrible as doom. Behind him lie the towers of torment, the vaults where his soul was measured and distilled, where sorcerers sought to bottle corruption as one might bottle wine. Before him lies a world both familiar and strange, a landscape through which he has passed before, but which he now perceives through senses the dark tower never meant to sharpen. In trying to forge him into a tool, Mordor's loremasters taught him to hear the ring's true voice, to distinguish its singular frequency from all the noise and clamor of his wants and fears. In trying to extract his hunger, they showed him the architecture of his own damnation, and in seeing it thus made clinical and strange, he gained the terrible gift of distance enough to observe, if not to cure. And in trying to bind him with wraithcraft and scythethorns, with broadcasts and chorales, and all the machinery of modern dark power, they forgot the older lesson, the one the spiders and the deep places know, that the small and broken can slip through nets designed for grander prey, that hunger sustained over centuries develops a patience that tactical urgency cannot match. Did the dark tower's study arm its own undoing? Did the hound they trained carry, unknowing, the seed of their collapse? The answer would come in time, in the high places of Emyn, in the stairs of Cirith Ungol, where promises to spiders come due, in the chambers of the enemy, where the smallest and most broken of creatures would stand at the very precipice of the world's ending, and in that moment of absolute extremity succumb to the hunger the tower itself had refined to terrible purity. But that ending lay far ahead, through months and years of pursuit, of riddles and betrayals, of alliances forged and broken, of journeys that would carry the ring itself into the very heart of darkness. And whether Gollum was truly free, or whether he merely thought himself free while dancing still to rhythms written into his bones by ring and tower both, was a question without easy answer. What can be said is this: he endured, through captivity and experiment, through bargains with spiders and loresmasters and the competing hungers of his divided soul, he endured, and in enduring, in surviving by wit and cunning, through the very worst the Dark Lord's servants could devise, he kept alive the possibility, fragile and perhaps doomed, but real, that even a creature as ruined as he might yet act in ways that the great powers had not foreseen. The darkness deepens now, the stars are veiled, the road winds on through marsh and forest and stone, leading ever toward a confrontation that will unmake the world or redeem it. Asterisk, asterisk, sleep now, wanderer. Asterisk, asterisk, let the tale settle into the quiet places of thought. Let the questions it raises linger like smoke in the corners of dreams. When you wake, the world will be itself again, no dark tower, no ring, no spider's bargain. But somewhere in the telling, in the examination of how small creatures endure great evils, how corruption studied can be corrupted, in turn, how even the most careful plans of tyrants can be overturned by the chaos introduced by a single determined broken thing. Somewhere in all of this, there may be a truth worth carrying into daylight. Asterisk, asterisk, rest well. And if the tale pleased you, remember it in the morning, and perhaps share it with another who seeks these quiet histories, these forgotten truths. Asterisk, asterisk, the tale is told, the chronicle is sealed. Until we meet again in the twilight hour, farewell.